Walter Isaacson, que é a biografia do Steve Jobs, vendeu 120 mil exemplares no Brasil, mais de 5 milhões nos Estados Unidos, cerca de 2 milhões na China e no mundo inteiro acima de 10 milhões de exemplares, o que é um feito, e o livro realmente é muito bom. Parabéns pelo livro, Walter, realmente é muito interessante. E eu gostaria de perguntar, a primeira pergunta, como é que você fez para... o livro, em certos aspectos, é muito crítico ao Steve Jobs, conta tudo o que aconteceu com ele. Como é que você fez para manter uma relação com ele, mesmo tendo todas essas críticas? E como é que ele era? A minha impressão é que ele era muitos aspectos, um chato, era um sujeito obsessivo, um sujeito maníaco, bruto, tratava mal as pessoas. Como é que foi a sua relação com ele e qual a sua opinião sobre ele como figura humana?
He was very emotional, very intense, but you had to tie that in with the passion he had for the products he created. And to me, the interesting thing was the lessons about how innovative and how he would intensely focus on things. I found him to be emotional, as you said. Sometimes we'd be talking and he'd just start crying. He was so emotional. But if you look at Apple products, you see he poured his emotion into the products he made. So to say that he was intense or sometimes rude, yes, but that's not the story of Steve. The story is how that impatience became part of the passion for the products he was making, how he had such a good focus, how he could simplify things. And he was tough on people, but he made them do things they thought were impossible. They called it the reality distortion field. He could make you believe that you could do things that you had always thought were impossible. And sometimes it would be tough, but a lot of times people did what they didn't think they could do. So you have to judge him by the results. He could be boorish, but the people who liked working with him became deeply loyal because he was charismatic, he was inspiring, and he had a team of people throughout his career who stayed loyal to him.
Mas e com você? Ele era um sujeito bruto, era um sujeito afável? Você considerava ele um amigo ou um sujeito de biografia?
It was very difficult because I got emotionally attached. And as a journalist, Marielle, you know, we try to be a little bit detached, try to be objective, especially when he was sick. I became, I cared for him emotionally. I respected him. I admired him. He was generally very nice to me. I mean, he could be charming just like he could be rude at times. The one time he got mad is when he saw a proposed cover of the book. And he thought the cover was really ugly. It had sort of an apple and his picture in it. He said, that's the worst thing I've ever seen, except for he used stronger language than that. And he said, I'm not going to cooperate with you anymore because that's so ugly. And then finally he said, I'll only keep cooperating if you let me have some input in the cover design. And I said, yes, I mean, of course, because he has a great eye for design. So he helped design the cover of the book. Usually we had a very good relationship, but I've seen him be tough on people. And so I got to see, when I first met him was 1984. He brought the original Macintosh to Time magazine where I was working. And he showed us the beauty of the design of the user interface. Got very emotional about that. But then he also got very mad at Time magazine, said we were a horrible magazine because we had not made him Man of the Year and we had written a piece about him he didn't like. So even in that first meeting, I saw both sides of Steve Jobs.
Walter, ele tentou mexer na capa, mas não no conteúdo. Ele tentou mexer no conteúdo também. Alguma vez ele fez alguma restrição ao que você iria escrever, poderia escrever, ou não?
Ou, complementando, ele leu o seu livro inteiro?
No. He said, near the very end, just as he had said at the beginning, this is your book, I will not try to control it. He said, I won't even read it, because if I read it, I'll try to control it. And that was the deal we had going in, was that I got to write everything I wanted. He had no control, which is unusual, because as you know, he was a very controlling guy. But he said, I want this to feel like an independent book. I don't want it to feel like an in-house book. I'm brutally honest with people. I want you to be honest about me. And the last time I went to see him, right before he died, I was in his bedroom, and he looked at me and he said, there'll be things in this book I don't like, right? And I said, yeah, there'll be things you don't like. And he said, good, I won't read it before it gets printed because I don't want to get mad at you, but I want it to be an honest book. And he said, I'll read it a year from now. And even then, when I thought, oh, so maybe he'll live another year because he had such a way of making you believe things. But he never read what was in the book, and he wanted it to be independent.
Walter, ele morreu, não leu o livro inteiro e falta nesse livro as últimas palavras dele. Você pode nos dizer quais foram?
You know, we were sitting in the garden of his house in Palo Alto near the end, and we had talked over the years about spirituality, how he had been on a Zen Buddhist quest, his Zen training. And he said to me, I asked him about whether he thought about God or spirituality more now that he was maybe dying. And he said, you know, sometimes I really believe in a God, I really believe in a spirit, I believe there's something more to life than just what you see. And maybe because of my Zen training, I like to believe that something lives on after you die, that your accumulated wisdom continues. And then he paused and he said, but maybe it's just like an on-off switch. You die and click, you're gone. And then I paused for a moment and he sort of smiled and said, that's why I never like to put on-off switches on Apple devices.
Walter. Eu gostaria de saber, eu tive alguns contactos como jornalista, realmente, o lançamento do Lisa em 1983, o Macintosh em 84 e o anúncio de várias coisas. Eu sei da dificuldade que ele tinha de conversar com jornalistas, principalmente em entrevistas exclusivas. Tentei várias vezes e jamais consegui. Qual foi, que facilidade você tinha, que amizade você desenvolveu para poder fazer uma biografia como essa, que deve ter tido muitas horas de conversação com o próprio Steve Jobs?
Yes, it surprised me, actually, that he wanted to open up so much, because he's very controlling and very private. I had met him, as I said, in 1984 when he first launched the Macintosh. And in 2004, he gave me a call. I had written a biography of Benjamin Franklin, was just about to finish one on Albert Einstein. And he said, why don't you do a biography of me next? And at first I thought, well, that's a little arrogant, you know, Ben Franklin, Albert Einstein, then you, Steve. And I didn't know he was sick. And so I said, well, maybe in 20 or 30 years, when you retire, I'll do it. But then over the next 2 or 3 years, I realized how sick he was. Yeah. I also realized he had transformed so many industries, personal computers, digital animation, music, stores, journalism, tablet computing. And I realized that there were some business lessons in there for how do you be creative and innovative. And so when we started, we just took long walks, and he would talk.
Por que você acha que ele te escolheu para ser seu biógrafo?
I asked him, and he originally said, because you're both a journalist and you like writing history. So you can do the archives, the historical stuff, but you get people to talk. That surprised me, because I didn't think he would want people to talk about him. But he liked it being a journalist, and I don't really know. He could have had anybody he wanted.
Mas vocês eram próximos? Vocês mantinham contato?
Not really. We would talk 2 or 3 times a year. When I was editor of Time magazine, maybe twice a year I was his best friend, because he would call up and he'd say, I have this new product and Newsweek will never understand it, but Time will. And, he'd come, he'd take me to dinner. And then the next day I wouldn't hear from him afterwards until, we did the story. But I knew him some, but not very well.
Walter, e todo o tempo que você passou com ele no processo de escrever esse livro, que acho que foram mais de 40 entrevistas, qual foi a maior surpresa, a revelação que mais se surpreendeu sobre a vida dele nesse tempo todo que você passou com ele?
I think the thing that surprised me the most was his emotionalism. I'd be talking to him about the Macintosh, even about the ad, the Think Different ad, or about his wife, or about his anniversary. And all of a sudden he would be crying. And I would be surprised at first. Then I realized that that emotionalism was just part of his intensity. And he even poured it in everything he did. For example, the box in which you get your iPod or iPad, he has a design patent on that because he wants it to be an emotional experience. Not like when you're opening some, phone from Samsung or something. He wants it to feel emotional. And so that emotional intensity was what surprised me the most, Todd.
E ele chegou a falar bastante sobre a rivalidade com Bill Gates. Como era Steve Jobs falando de Bill Gates?
They were like binary stars, astronomy, two stars that circle each other because they're caught up in the gravitational field. Bill Gates got his start writing software mainly for the Apple II originally. But then he took the graphical interface of the Macintosh and he made Windows out of it. That made Steve furious, and Steve, just sued him. And not only did he do that, Bill Gates had a different philosophy, which is he licensed out his software, the Windows software, to anybody who made machines, IBM, Compaq, HP. Steve Jobs was a control freak. If you wanted his software, you had to get his hardware. It all was integrated together. And as you know, those are the two approaches to the digital age. The closed, integrated approach and the open, licensed out approach. But when Steve came back in 1997 to Apple, one of his first phone calls was to Bill Gates. And he said, let's settle our lawsuits. I need you to start writing great software for the Macintosh. And Bill Gates did. And near the very end, last summer, Bill Gates wanted to come visit Steve because he knew Steve was sick. And Steve was kind of resisting it at first. Mm-hmm. But finally, Bill Gates just came to the house in Palo Alto and knocked on the back door and walked in, and there was, Steve. And they talked for 3 hours about their rivalry, but also how that bound them together. And in the end, Bill Gates said something nice, which was, I never thought the integrated model you had would work, but you proved it could work. And Steve, who's not always nice, said, and you proved your model could work. Later, I asked Steve about that because I thought that was a beautiful ending scene of the book. And of course, Steve ruins it slightly by saying, well, I told him his model worked, but it only works if you don't care about making junky products. That's all Bill Gates ever did was make junky products. So it was that friendship, rivalry, love, hate. You see that in business a lot.
Walter, você pinta no seu livro um retrato de um sujeito irascível, detalhista, maníaco, idiosincrático e também mentiroso, um pouco mentiroso, conta algumas mentiras. Eu vi nas redes sociais, nos twitters, nos blogs, alguns fãs da Apple reclamando um pouco disso, né? Dá para você falar um pouco desse lado paradoxal? Nós temos um gênio, quase que uma espécie de gênio zen, de um lado, né? E um sujeito totalmente detalhista, irascível e algumas vezes mentiroso, roubando ideia dos outros. Isso aparece um pouco no seu livro também. Fala um pouco desse outro lado do Steve Jobs.
Sure. Well, I certainly admired Steve Jobs, and I had to be honest. So there were times that, he was crazy or a misfit or a rebel. I don't think he ever really lied because I think sometimes he distorted reality, but he believed, even when he was saying things, he would say things that sort of distorted reality, but he was so intense, he kind of believed it. So I tried to be very fair to him, and people may have said I was tough, but Steve Jobs knew that he was that way. I would say, why are you so tough on people at times? He'd say, that's who I am. I expect brutal honesty out of everybody I work with, and I'm brutally honest with them. If something is bad, I say it's bad. Sometimes I use stronger language, as I said. But that's the way we work together. And, when I portray him as a little bit crazy, but he loved that line that he wrote at the end of the Think Different ads, which is the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. So I try to tie it together, and I don't think I'm too tough on him because I really do admire him, and I think that craziness was part of what made him successful.
Walter, eu me surpreendi um pouco no livro justamente por causa dessas características, que não tem mais pessoas que falam que realmente odiavam ele. Essas pessoas existem, ou elas acabaram, ele acabou se reconciliando com elas no fim da vida, quer dizer, como você vê isso?
Well, everything I have in the book is on the record. And as a journalist, you know, some people say bad things, but they want to do it off the record. I said, no. You work with Steve. You know he likes honesty. And so all those tales of where he got mad at somebody, or he would tell Steve Wozniak, his original partner, you can do this. And Woz would say, no, I can't. And say, well, you have to do it. And it wasn't totally true, but then Wozniak would do it. Like he would write the software in 4 days, or he would make something better. And so all of those tales in the book are from people who in the end admired Steve Jobs. And I tried to keep the book away from anonymous quotes and people on background telling me bad things. I said, look, if you're going to say things, have the courage, as he would, to be honest and upfront and say them to people's face.
Mas você acha então que tem pessoas que ficaram intimidadas pela figura dele de falar certas coisas em on?
Oh, I think, yeah, he was intimidating, but people were very honest. If you ask people questions and you listen, so even the people who liked him the most, you know, Johnny Ive, the great industrial designer, he would have designed a set just like this TV set, you know, beautiful and white. But Johnny Ive was very honest about him, both the things he loved and the things he didn't.
Qual que é a importância maior do Steve Jobs? Pelo seu livro, parece que ele era várias coisas. Era um tecnólogo, era um inventor, era um homem de propaganda, era um homem de marketing, era um capitalista. Em qual desses campos ele foi mais importante?
I think the most important thing he did was connect creativity, sort of art and beauty and imagination, to technology. That's something you don't see in a Bill Gates or many other technologists, is the love of beautiful design, the love of art and product, the belief in music so that you create an iPod that's just so perfect. So I think that's his legacy. And I asked him, what is your most important product? I thought he might say the iPad or the iPhone or the Macintosh. He said Apple, the company, because people create products all the time. Products come and go. But the important thing is to create a place in which people can be imaginative and apply that imagination to engineering. And so creating a great company is harder than creating a great product.
Walter, nesse sentido que você acaba de apresentar, eu gostaria de uma comparação sua. A contribuição do Steve Jobs é comparável à de outros líderes que revolucionaram a indústria, por exemplo, Graham Bell, Thomas Edison ou Henry Ford? Você o compararia nesse mesmo nível?
Absolutely. You know, when he died, people were comparing him to Leonardo da Vinci and, you know, Michelangelo. I think that was overdoing it a bit. But he created companies just like Edison did with General Electric, just like Walt Disney did with the Disney Company, that had as its main characteristic a place where imagination was applied to technology and to business. And so I think his legacy will be right up there with Edison, Ford, Walt Disney, more so than Alexander Graham Bell. If you look at Edison, he transformed 4 or 5 industries, everything from the phonograph to movies to whatever. But Steve was very much like that. He transforms music, transforms the making of movies, the personal computer. So I think, and Edison, by the way, was not the nicest person in the world. You talk about all the craziness and irascibility of Steve Jobs. Well, Edison was that way as well, but we don't remember that about Edison. We remember the creativity, the inventiveness of Edison.
Walter.
Tá,
E
não,
no
pera,
caso da-
pera um pouquinho, Etevaldo, nós temos que fazer um pequeno intervalo, nós já voltamos com o Walter Isaacson. Um momento, vamos lá. O Roda Viva conversa hoje com Walter Isaacson, biógrafo de Steve Jobs. Etevaldo Siqueira vai acabar a pergunta dele.
A pergunta é com relação à Apple. Na sua resposta anterior, você disse que, mais do que qualquer produto, a grande criação que ele gostava era a própria empresa Apple. O que vai acontecer com a Apple sem o Steve Jobs, na sua opinião?
I always joke that wherever I go, people ask the same question in different ways, which is, should I sell my Apple stock or not? I think Apple has been infused with the creativity of Steve Jobs, so that Tim Cook, Johnny Ive, people like Scott Forstall, Eddie Q, Phil Schiller, they really get what it's all about. And I think Apple will continue to do really great things. It'll have a great iPad 3, probably do television, things like that. And you see that Apple is continuing on this trajectory. I don't know what happens after 5 years, after the people Steve trained, maybe they start retiring. But with the people Steve put in there, that tight team, we talked about him being tough on people, but the people who worked with him loved him and were very loyal. And so that team is very tight, and they understand his vision.
E as ações estão lá em cima também?
Oh, his stock has gone from, 400 to 550 in the past month or so. But I don't do stock picking. If I could pick stocks, I wouldn't have to write biographies.
Walter,
Todd Benson quer fazer uma pergunta.
falar em biografias, você também escreveu biografias de outras figuras importantes. Henry Kissinger, Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, agora Steve Jobs. Há alguns pontos em comum entre esses 4 figuras que você retratou nesses livros?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, they're very different. Benjamin Franklin was as sweet and as nice and as easygoing and compromising at times as Steve was tough. But here's one quality they all shared. They were smart, but that wasn't it, because we all know a lot of smart people, and smart people don't always amount to much. They don't get much done. But what counts is being imaginative, being able to think a little bit differently. That's what Benjamin Franklin did in the founding of America. He was the one who was able to say, let's create a system with a House and a Senate, states and a national government, and make it all balanced. Likewise, Einstein was able to say, well, every other physicist was trying to figure out, why is the speed of light constant? Einstein was just a patent clerk. He couldn't get a job as a professor. But he said, maybe it's because time is relative. That time's not absolute. Time is different depending on your state of motion. A totally, radically different concept. And Steve Jobs was very good at being imaginative and thinking different. So that's what I like to look for in the people I write about. Not just being smart, but being imaginative.
E no Kissinger? Você fez uma biografia do Kissinger também. O que você viu nele de diferente em relação aos outros 3?
Henry Kissinger was able to create both a big framework for foreign policy of the United States, whatever you may think of his foreign policy, which was to balance China off against Russia, when before then we had thought Russia and China were both sort of the same communists. And so getting out of Vietnam with a balance of Russia and China was a different framework that he and Richard Nixon together came up with. Kissinger, like Steve Jobs, was able to see the big sweep of things, but cared deeply about the details. He understood, say, in the Middle East, but in trying to get the peace between the Syrians, the Egyptians, and the Israelis, which I wish we had somebody like him today doing, he would be able to talk about the grand scope of history, but also he would know every tree in the Gaza Strip. He would know every street corner in the Golan Heights.
E qual dessas biografias foi mais difícil de ser escrita? Qual lhe deu mais trabalho? E qual lhe deu mais alegria?
Well, the hardest was the one on Steve Jobs because it was so emotional, and I spent so much time with him. And as you know, you all have discussed, he was a difficult character at times, but I liked him. So I wanted to be honest, but I also wanted to be kind. And I tried to balance, here's his tough characteristics, but here's why they were important in making a genius. So that was quite difficult. The most fun was Benjamin Franklin. If I could go out and have a beer with anybody, it would be with Ben Franklin.
Walter, posso mudar de assunto para jornalismo? Fox News mudou um pouco a história do jornalismo nos Estados Unidos ao se colocar de uma forma tão partizã para a direita. A MSNBC reagiu e se colocou um pouco mais à esquerda. A CNN se manteve fiel aos padrões do jornalismo neutro e imparcial e aparentemente perdeu muita audiência, perdeu muito espaço. Uma pergunta e uma opinião. A situação continua a mesma, a CNN continua em terceiro lugar. E a opinião, você acha que há espaço ainda para o jornalismo imparcial, apartidário, ou o futuro do jornalismo vai ser partizã e apaixonado como Fox é?
Well, I think that Fox, MSNBC, different blogs, different newspapers all serve a purpose, and it's actually better to have a wide array of opinions. It used to be in America we had 3 networks, and you know they were all pretty much the same, and Walter Cronkite would say that's the way it is at the end of the broadcast. I think it's better to have a spectrum of opinion, and people actually switch around so they get different opinions. That's a cool thing. I think CNN is actually doing quite well. It doesn't always win at the ratings, but by having a reliable newscast and having things people trust, it gets good advertising rates, it makes money. So I think there will always be room for the type of news I like, which is very centrist and I think very objective. There'll always be a place for that, yes.
Ainda em jornalismo, você começou a sua carreira em Londres, não é verdade? O seu primeiro emprego jornalístico foi em Londres. É. Como é que você vê a situação da imprensa inglesa agora com essa crise tremenda que os tabloides e os jornais em geral estão vivendo?
I think that was a worse problem. Not somebody being on the left or being on the right or being partisan, but doing things that just weren't right. Hacking into phones, bribing people. And sometimes, you know journalism, people go too far. I think things will right themselves. I think that British journalism is truly wonderful. I mean, it's exuberant, it's exciting, and people went a bit too far, but I think they've now been curbed.
Walter, outra pergunta de jornalismo e tecnologia. No seu livro fica uma coisa meio inconclusa, inclusive por Steve Jobs, as relações entre tecnologia e jornalismo. Você foi diretor de redação, managing editor da revista Time, que foi um marco no jornalismo americano no século passado. Muitos de nós crescemos lendo a Time. Hoje a Time é quase nada, a influência dela é muito pequena. Essa invenção do Henry Lewis, a revista semanal de notícias, tem futuro? Frente a essa avalanche online, frente à tecnologia, essa fórmula ainda tem alguma esperança ou não?
I think actually the iPad will help because the iPad and other tablet computers give you a chance to make a beautiful magazine, a product where people can scroll through, flip it, see the pictures. Time Magazine's app on the iPad is actually very good. And the other problem I think we had over the past 10 years is we journalists, people who wrote magazines or newspapers, put it all online for free.
Yeah.
This is not a good business model, to give everything away for free. But with the iPad, you can say, here's a nice product, just like you pay 99 cents or $1.29 for a song, you should pay for this app. So I hope that in the next few years, there'll be beautiful products. I love magazines, even if they come out just once a week. You see the beautiful pictures, the thoughtful writing. I think tablets will be a good device, unlike computers on your desktop, for looking at magazines. So maybe we survive.
Mas a periodicidade semanal é que me parece que está em dificuldade nessa fórmula do News Magazine, da revista semanal de notícias. As revistas semanais que estão indo melhor são a The New Yorker e Economist. Time e Newsweek, nem tanto. Teria um caminho como essas outras duas, vamos dizer?
Yeah, I think Time Magazine has a much bigger circulation than either of the two magazines you mentioned. So once you find the business model, it works well. But the examples you use, take the New Yorker. That's a wonderful magazine with really great deep writing. And people pay for it and go to it on tablet computers. So I think that tablets like the iPad will open a new possibilities for good pictures, good design, and long-form journalism.
E papel esquecemos, então.
Well, I think paper's a cool technology. It's a great technology. If we have been getting all of our news on screens for 400 years, and somebody came along and said, I can put it on paper, so you can take it to the airport with you, or to the backyard, or the bus, or the bathtub, and you can flip through it and stuff, and I'll deliver it to your door, people would say, wow, paper, that's a great technology. That's going to replace the internet someday.
Ô Walter, eu sou muito curioso e queria que você nos contasse um pouco do seu atual grande trabalho, que é presidente do Aspen Institute. Você pode nos contar o que faz o Aspen Institute?
Right. The Aspen Institute tries to hold the center together. In a country in which the United States is getting very polarized, we know that on most problems there is a sensible solution, and we try to be a nonpartisan think tank for that solution. Secondly, we do leadership training. For young leaders around the world, we're doing things in Brazil, which is one of the reasons I came down here. We're doing things in the Middle East, where we bring young leaders around the world and say, here are the basic values. Let's study them, learn them, and see how we can work together. So it gives me a chance to study policy, to get involved in ideas, but also to do what Ben Franklin would have done, which is bring people together.
Eu vou continuar nesse assunto que achei uma das perguntas que eu já tinha. Sobre a situação atual nos Estados Unidos, a cultura política, que estamos vendo um mundo bastante polarizado entre os dois partidos nos Estados Unidos. Qual é a sua opinião sobre essa conjuntura atual nos Estados Unidos? Um momento de crise econômica, polarização política. Qual o caminho que você vê Estados Unidos indo daqui para frente numa cultura política tão conflitiva?
It's not as bad as you think. Look, when Albert Einstein in the early 1950s as an old man watched Joseph McCarthy and the Red Scares in America and the polarization happening then, he writes to his son, I've seen this before. It happened in Nazi Germany. It happened with the communists. And then a few years later, McCarthy's gone, Eisenhower's gotten rid of him, and Einstein says, there's something magical in America. It's like a gyroscope. When you think it's going to fall over, it rights itself. I think there's something magical about democracy in general. It works here in Brazil. It works in America. You have to remember, as you do, that just 4 years ago, both parties nominated the person who was most centrist in a way and could work together. Barack Obama, who said he could work across the aisle. John McCain. Now, we've gone through a tailspin in the past 2 years. But I suspect that after this election, we'll get righted again.
Você teve experiência com o presidente Obama. Qual é a sua experiência com ele? Você, inclusive, te nomeou para um cargo que até recentemente você ocupou. Como tem sido o seu contato com ele?
Well, I admire Barack Obama. I think he's a very smart, decent guy. I think he's facing troubling times with the economy, so there's a polarization. I think he's handled everything from righting the American economy to getting bin Laden to the difficulties of pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan pretty well. I'm not a partisan. I'm registered as an independent. I admire a lot of, Republicans as well. But I think when we get polarized, we demonize, Republicans are demonizing Barack Obama. Democrats are demonizing Santorum and Romney. I think we all overstated a bit much, and I actually admire President Obama.
E como foi trabalhar no governo, Walter? Você sempre trabalhou na iniciativa privada e durante alguns anos agora você trabalhou no governo. E o que o seu trabalho foi com a Voz da América e a Rádio Europa Livre e outras emissoras internacionais dos Estados Unidos, certo?
And Voice of America, yeah.
Exato. E qual é o sentido disso num mundo como hoje? Quer dizer, eu consigo ver o sentido da Voz da América na Guerra Fria. Ainda faz sentido ter uma rádio internacional de governo?
Yes. Well, to your first question, working in government's pretty hard. It's kind of bureaucratic. You can't get things done. You come back to the Aspen Institute or to say, okay, I want this done, and it gets done. But in government, nothing ever seems to get done. So I found that a bit frustrating. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia play a very important role. I mean, we have to realize that in most countries, it's not like Brazil. You don't have all sorts of people sitting around a room like this who work for different news organizations. And I also think that the internet helps us, because if you had to invent something if you were inventing Voice of America, you'd say, let's invent the internet where everybody can discuss things and there's a free flow of information. So I hope someday you won't need Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, or the BBC. But I think right now there are lots of places, be it even China, where it's very useful to get another side of the story there.
Walter, só mais uma perguntinha. Essa cultura de computadores, principalmente blogs, redes sociais, isso você acha que contribui para a imprensa? Porque às vezes a agressividade que aparece nesses fóruns, o amadorismo, o parti pris é tão grande,
Right.
e que os nossos leitores vão muito para isso. Então a imprensa, vamos dizer, séria, investigativa, às vezes me parece que ela está perdendo espaço. Você acha que está acontecendo isso? Acha que a imprensa está ficando pior, mais fraca ou não?
I think that the business model for the traditional press got undermined a bit when everything on the internet seemed to be free. Secondly, I think blogging and, people who just are there expressing their opinions
Yes. rather
rather than reporting, there's some use to that. It's good to have lots of people expressing opinions. It's better than if they were just sitting at home, sitting back and watching television and believing everything they saw. However, I think you even see it happening now. People realize they can't get their news from a lot of blogs. They have to get news from people who actually send out reporters, try to get the facts right, cover things. So you're seeing, I think, people reading blogs a little bit less. There's probably more people blogging than there are people reading blogs these days. And you see organizations like yours. I read Reuters every day. I see the New York Times, Washington Post every day. People going back to information they trust. Because when you have 1,000 sources of information, what's the most important thing? Credibility, trust.
Mas será que essa sua leitura, você me perdoa, será que não é uma questão de idade, de geração? Porque eu não vejo jovens indo muito para a imprensa, não. Não sei nos Estados Unidos.
Well, I'm watching my daughter, who's 21 years old, and all of her friends. They're gravitating away sometimes from social media. They go to places that they trust for information. I remember about 5 years ago talking to some kids, and I said, where do you get your news? They said, we get our news from Google. I said, well, who does Google have covering Afghanistan? Who does Google have covering the World Cup? And they kind of looked at me crazy and stuff. But nowadays, I think even younger people, they're literate. They know how to assess what they're reading on the internet. And I think they gravitate to places they trust.
Well,
Ok, nós vamos para um rápido intervalo e já voltamos com o escritor americano Walter Isaacson. Até lá. O Roda Viva de hoje tem no centro da arena Walter Isaacson, biógrafo de Steve Jobs e de Albert Einstein. O Etevaldo Siqueira, eu cortei a palavra, agora ele volta.
Walter, esse cenário todo da internet, além desses aspectos que você já mencionou, o impacto que tem em blogs e realmente essa agressividade dos comentários que realmente quase que emocionais na sua maioria, isso é um dos aspectos. O outro aspecto é o da propriedade intelectual, dos direitos de autor, por exemplo, que ficam profundamente ameaçados. Isso é um dos esteios da imprensa tradicional, né? Principalmente dos livros, não só o livro, a revista e os jornais, né? Qual é a sua visão com relação ao futuro desses direitos intelectuais e propriedade, copyrights em geral?
Yes, an important question. And when Mario talked about arguments with younger people, the big argument I have with my daughter and her friends is protecting intellectual property, which I think is important. You know, for 400 years, ever since the Statute of Anne in England, we've had the ability to create books, music, art, plays, intellectual property, and copy them, and people can buy copies, and it's called a copyright, and the person who wrote it has the right to profit from that. And I think we need to preserve that in the digital realm so that, you know, if my book is online and people are taking it for free, that makes it harder to write books in the future. So if we want an era in which people make books and music and plays and art, we have to say you can make digital copies, but we have to have some right to say you can't just take it and make it free. You know, I think even Steve Jobs believed very strongly in that, which is why when he created the iPod, he made it very easy to get songs legally for 99 cents, and he made it very hard to steal songs and get it. And he said you shouldn't steal songs. Likewise with the iPad, he's making it easy for people to make small charges in order to sell their newspapers, magazines, and books online. So I think things are getting better. If you look at music, if you look at books, you see a lot of people buying it online instead of sharing it for free. But I agree with you, that's the important thing in the digital age.
Paula Leite.
Walter, quando você fala, por exemplo, que Steve Jobs era um gênio, mas no livro você não resiste à tentação de achar uma explicação simples ou um fato da vida dele que explica por que ele era do jeito que ele era. Esse nível de complexidade é uma coisa que a gente vê cada vez menos justamente nesse jornalismo mais online, em tempo real. Você acha que tem espaço para uma apuração desse tipo, ou isso vai ficar mais em livros e a gente vai ter no jornalismo mais do dia a dia realmente essa coisa, queremos explicações simples, queremos fatos que não são complexos?
Yeah. I tried to tell the story. I tried to tell the story, for example, of him being given up at birth, being adopted, finding out he was adopted, finding his birth mother, finding his adoptive sister. All those things shaped who he was, his need for control, his feeling that he was special, maybe that he was abandoned. I let him talk about that. But I leave it to other people to try to do some of the analysis. My particular thing I brought to this book was to be able to hear his story, have him tell me, have everybody around him, 150 people I talked to, tell me about it, and for me to just put it in an objective storytelling way. When I was growing up, I had an uncle who said there were two types of people who came out of Louisiana, preachers and storytellers. He said, for goodness sake, be a storyteller. The world has too many preachers. So I don't try to preach in this book, but I try to give all the information so the reader, and for that matter, other authors, can analyze it and say, here's why he was so smart, or here's why he was so ingenious, or here's why he was so controlling. It stems from this part of his background.
Walter, nós temos uma pergunta que nós gravamos de uma biógrafa brasileira que ela vai falar para você, tá?
Qual é o risco do biógrafo se apaixonar pelo seu personagem? Como manter a distância entre você e a pessoa que você está biografando?
You know, that's a good question, and I did get very emotionally attached to him. Of course, if you've heard the questions this evening, it's all about you were tough, you showed he was irascible, you showed he was mean to people. So you try to be honest. I think, you know, we're all journalists. It happens every day in every story you write, which is if you're a normal person, you kind of are kind. You want to believe people. yet you have to keep your objectivity. So I think a lot of people have, said my book was a little too tough on them. And a lot of people said, well, I got far too close to him. I just tried to do the best I could and let the reader make the decision. And I just told the story and what he told me, but what everybody else told me, and tried to show all sides of him.
O seu livro foi muito elogiado pela crítica por esse aspecto, pela sua objetividade, a sua tentativa de compreensão. Mas um crítico da London Review of Books, ele diz que há um certo exagero, que você meio que enaltece o Steve Jobs, principalmente quando você compara as invenções da Apple, o iPad, o iPod, o iPhone, o tablet, com o jardim Zen de Kyoto, no Japão, que há ali uma comparação. E ele fala, não, aqueles jardins estão lá 200 anos, 300 anos e vão continuar lá. E os produtos da Apple, daqui a 5 anos, já estarão completamente obsoletos. Como você responde a essa crítica, Walter?
I think that he was able to transform a lot of industries that'll never be the same again. The notion of the Macintosh computer feeling so friendly that you put it in your kitchen, that you can touch it, that the normal person would bring it home, that transformed computers from being something that, corporations and the Pentagon had to something that was personal. Likewise, he transformed the music industry, the journalism industry, the movie industry. So I think he transformed a lot of things. When I compared the Zen gardens, I like to show that the Zen gardens are very sort of controlled. It's not letting 1,000 flowers bloom the way, say, Google and Android would let 1,000 people do things to open software. So he was very controlling. No, I don't think we will remember the iPod as long as 1,000 years from now with the Zen gardens. But I do think that you cannot find anybody of our day and generation who has transformed more industries than
Mas
Steve
isso não seria,
Jobs.
essas transformações não seriam uma característica desse ramo de indústria, da indústria do computador, ou ligada a essa alta tecnologia? Eu dou 3 exemplos, que ele não teve nada a ver. Skype, Twitter e Facebook, redes sociais. Todas elas foram inventadas e nada de Steve Jobs. Seria uma característica da indústria, tudo isso que ele fez. Sim ou não? Ou estou errado?
Oh, I think that social networks like Facebook have been a major transformation and change how we consume media. Skype, to me, is just a technology. I mean, it's like a camera and
But it's
internet.
free.
Right. That's a good business model, perhaps, or a bad business model, perhaps. I'm not sure it's the most inventive technology. I'm not saying that Steve invented everything, but I don't know that the person who created Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, has transformed 6 or 7 other industries the way Steve repeatedly transformed industries.
E Twitter?
Twitter, I may be old-fashioned, but I think 5 years from now, we won't think that was the most transformative, invention that we had in our time.
Walter, o Steve Jobs também foi uma pessoa muito elogiada, mas também muito criticada ao longo da vida dele. No teu contato com ele, qual era a crítica que as pessoas faziam a ele que mais fazia o sangue dele ferver? Qual era a crítica que ele mais odiava, detestava, ouvir a pessoa dele ou o trabalho dele?
Yeah. He was not a saint packaged for emulation, and there were a lot of valid criticisms. For example, he was not publicly very philanthropic, not very engaged in doing good works the way Ben Franklin. Every week, it seems, Ben Franklin was starting some new group to do good works. And Steve would get furious when you talk about philanthropy and why he didn't join Bill Gates' pledge to give away most of his money. Or when you talk about China and the factories in China and Foxconn, there were a lot of criticism of that. And he would say, I keep my focus on my product. These people are just distractions. So he would get angry at criticisms like that. But his strong suit was that he focused on very few things and didn't get distracted. Now, maybe you and I believe that philanthropic works are not a distraction, but something that should be core to your being. But he didn't feel that way. He said, I will transform education more by inventing the iPad than Bill Gates will with all of his philanthropy.
Perfeitamente, perfeitamente. Diga uma coisa, Walter. Você já disse que vai fazer um complemento para a biografia do Steve Jobs. O que falta nela?
Oh, well, my next book was going to be a history of the entire digital revolution. I left a few things out of the book, not much, but a few things like what he thought Apple TV should be, because Apple hadn't yet done it, and I felt that was maybe be unfair to Apple before they produced the TV for me to be reporting what Steve thought it should be. So I don't have any major revisions of the book at the moment, sorry.
Dos seus livros se chama Os Homens Sábios e é sobre grupo de intelectuais que ajudou a formar a política externa americana depois da Segunda Guerra Mundial. Onde estão os homens sábios que não vão mais para o governo? Por que os homens sábios não vão para o governo ou os homens sábios desapareceram? Qual é o problema entre homens sábios e governos hoje em dia?
You asked me earlier, Carlos, whether it was fun working in government. It's hard working in government now. It's very bureaucratic, but also, if you're a big businessman or something, the United States, it's a little bit hard to go into government these days because of all the conflict of interest rules and what you have to do with financial things. I think that's probably fine.
Mas era menos difícil em 1945 trabalhar no governo? O governo era mais
It was
fácil?
much easier, much easier. Averill Harriman, who's one of the wise men, he's there helping create Pan Am, but he's also helping create the air transport during World War II and using Pan Am bases. He's creating the railway, and he's keeping Brown Brothers Harriman together. So he goes in government, back to banking, in government, back to the Union Pacific Railway. Same with Robert Lovett, same with John McCloy, goes from the bank to the government. They were able to go back and forth between banking and government a little bit more easily than you can do today. Also, we're in a little bit more of a partisan time. The six wise men we wrote about, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, best friends, they worked for Democratic and Republican presidents. We were trying to celebrate that, and I think we could use more of it today.
Walter, eu gostaria que você comparasse o Steve Jobs com Wozniak, que é o cara o engenheiro que desenvolve, vamos dizer assim, a tecnologia do computador pessoal. E o Jobs era, como discutimos já, também era um homem de marketing, era um homem que via o desejo das pessoas em ter um produto cool, que pensava nas lojas, pensava no invólucro, pensava no coisa branco, no fio branco. E o outro era o homem ali da tecnologia. Um trabalhava com o fetichismo da mercadoria, Steve Jobs, e o outro com a realidade da tecnologia. Eu gostaria que você comparasse um com o outro.
Well, you know, Steve Wozniak creates a circuit board for what becomes the Apple I and then the Apple II. And he's giving it away at the Homebrew Computer Club.
Yeah.
And, you know, he doesn't know how to package. And if you get it, you have to put your own, components in. You have to get your own power supply. It was pretty useless. And as Steve Wozniak said, it was a beautifully designed circuit board, but it would be gathering dust in a hobbyist shop if Steve Jobs hadn't come along and helped me put it together. And they form Apple as a partnership. And Steve gets a person who does a great case for it, does the power supply, markets it. So sometimes it's not just the engineer who invents the circuit board, but it's the person who's able to make it friendly and accessible and simple for the rest of us to use who's important. I think Wozniak is enormously important, but if Steve Jobs hadn't come along, we would not have heard of Steve Wozniak.
Walter, você falou da questão da filantropia. Possivelmente as maiores críticas aí ao Steve Jobs como homem corporativo, como CEO, essa questão da filantropia e também aquele episódio da mudança da data das opções de ações, que foi bastante polêmico também, além da falta de transparência dele em relação a algumas outras questões, também como a doença dele. Na minha visão, eu acho que essas questões não tiveram muito espaço no livro. Por quê? Você quis concentrar mais nele como pessoa e menos como homem corporativo, vamos dizer assim?
Well, I think I have a whole chapter on the options and the backdating of the options issue. And the way he dealt with, transparency, both on the cancer, the options, I hope I talk about quite a bit. I do believe that you have to look at the whole picture of a Steve Jobs. As I said, I think earlier you said I was a little tough on him, and now saying, well, maybe I wasn't tough enough on the options issue. I try to put everything in perspective. That's what we do when we tell stories. We say these things are important. Here's what they add up to. I kind of feel I touched upon and looked into everything, including options, cancer, transparency. But I tried to say, look at the whole. Look what he created.
Walter, desculpe. Há momento dramático no seu livro. Ele faz os exames, sabe que tem câncer no pâncreas. Os médicos falam, o senhor precisa operar imediatamente. Ele fala, não, eu vou fazer as dietas. Ele era um homem que vinha da contracultura, zen, fazia dieta de frutas, jejuava. E ele fala, não, eu não vou fazer. E fica 9 meses sem ser operado, e aí o câncer se espalha, ele fica numa situação muito pior. Para um homem que você qualifica de gênio, isso é uma burrice? É uma coisa... a distorção da realidade? O que é isso?
I think it was a distortion of reality, but you have to understand, and I try to show this in the book, there are two sides to Steve Jobs. There's that counterculture, rules don't apply to me, rebel, misfit, hippie,
Drugs.
Romantic person. And there's the hard-nosed technologist, business, pragmatic person. Those two are always sort of the different sides of his personality. And in almost every case, they eventually come together to create the Macintosh, something that both owes a lot to the counterculture, but also a great piece of technology. So it happened with his cancer treatment. When he gets diagnosed, two things happen. He spends a lot of time thinking the rules don't apply, that reality distortion sets in, that maybe I can treat it with diets in a counterculture, romantic, hippie-ish way. But he also looks at genetic sequencing, has the DNA encoded of his cancer, his own DNA sequenced, gets targeted therapies, molecular targeted therapies. You almost see both extremes. You're right, it takes a while, unfortunately, for those two streams to come together. Had he been operated on earlier, would it have still spread? He doesn't know. I don't know. His doctors don't know. Cancer, it metastasizes in mysterious ways. I think he regretted. He was controlling. He did not want his body opened up. He regretted postponing that decision, but it was very much like Steve to sort of have both sides at a tug of war before he reconciled them.
Mas naquela hora lado venceu e foi ruim para ele, né?
I certainly don't believe you should be treating cancer with diets. You're right. And I think I made that clear, Paula, in the book. Yeah.
Walter, você deve ter assistido alguns lançamentos conduzidos pelo próprio Steve Jobs, quase sempre no Moscone Center em São Francisco, em que a plateia o recebia como um popstar. Cada detalhe que ele anunciava dos produtos, aplausos e gritos, inclusive jornalistas, que me surpreendia, porque muitos de nós somos usuários, evidentemente. O que é que explica, por exemplo, não só a mística dele, mas a mística em relação aos produtos? As pessoas se apaixonam pelo iPod, pelo iPad, pelo iPhone agora, tá certo? Como foi por Macintosh, como outros se apaixonaram por uma Harley Davidson, uma motocicleta. No nosso tempo, uma câmera Leica, por exemplo, era um show desse tipo. Que mística é essa? Que só alguns produtos têm e só alguns líderes têm.
He spent a lot of time learning how to be a great showman. From the very first launch in 1984 of the Macintosh, with that beautiful ad of the woman throwing the hammer at Big Brother when the thought police were chasing it, and doing the dramatic unfolding. There's Macintosh sitting on the table, speaking, saying, "Hi, I'm Macintosh." He knew how to capture people's imagination because he was a showman. And he knew that creating a mystique for a product was almost as important as creating the product. And journalists, you're absolutely right, fell for it every single time. You'd go there and the journalists would be cheering and applauding as well. But that was part of the charisma that he had, the inspiring nature that he had, and his ability to distort reality sometimes that he had. That was part and parcel of who he was.
Bom, agora o Roda Viva vai para o último intervalo e a gente volta daqui a pouco com Walter Isaacson. Estamos no último bloco do Roda Viva com o escritor americano Walter Isaacson. Walter, você vendeu tantos livros, só nesse aqui mais de 10 milhões de livros. Eu imagino que você esteja quase tão rico quanto Steve Jobs. Isso muda a tua vida? O que você faz com agora um jornalista fica tão rico assim?
No, I assume it's not made me rich. It's all about Steve Jobs, this book. It's not people are buying it because of me. I hope to still be a journalist. I hope to still write books. I hope to be involved in the things I think are important in this world, maybe be able to give a little bit more money away. But I certainly hope I don't start living like, somebody who's a little bit too rich. I don't think that. By the way, Steve Jobs was good that way. Let's turn it back to him. He had all that money. He lived in a normal house. He was home every night with his kids for dinner around a wooden table in the kitchen. He did not have all sorts of vacation homes. He enjoyed living pretty well, but he didn't have cars and drivers and retinues. I think it's important, and I'm certainly not rich the way he was and never will be, but I think it's important to look at Steve Jobs and say he did not do it for money. He did not let money go to his head.
Tem vamos dizer, o único luxo dele é fazer a Apple comprar um jato, né, um Gulfstream, né, uma coisa...
Yeah.
Mas tem um pedaço no livro que ele está com uma namorada em Paris, que você escreveu, que eles estão à beira do Sena e ela fala... Larga tudo, vamos comprar uma casa na Provence, vamos criar os filhos, ter os nossos netos. Ele já era muito rico. E ele fala, não, vou voltar para lá, para Palo Alto, ficar naquela coisa. Você não tem essa vontade de também abandonar um pouco as coisas, Walter?
No, and I don't think he wanted to abandon. He could have abandoned everything many times. He didn't do it for the money. But I think all of us like, as he said, to create something and to put it back into the flow of history. We're lucky, you, me, Steve Jobs, we get good things, things happen, we make a living, we have a job. And so you want to create things that are kind of nice and cool and people can have them. And it's like you're putting back into this world because you were able to benefit. He did it more than anybody. He could have retired anytime, but until he died, he was still there working on what would a TV set look like. What would a great camera look like? What would textbooks be like? He didn't need to do that, but I think he was driven by the desire to create products, not the desire to make money.
Agora, isso também tinha um preço, né? Porque ele, me parece, pelo seu livro, que ele não conseguia relaxar também, né? Que ele era tão intenso que não conseguia, enfim, easy going, ser easy going.
Well, I think he was certainly better at making products than taking vacations. He did not relax very well.
Walter,
Yes.
você tem iPhone?
I have an iPhone, I have an
seu
iPad, I
computador?
have a Mac.
O seu computador é um Mac, então, Macintosh.
I have two computers, yes. I have a Dell and a Macintosh, yeah. And MacBook Air, yeah.
Nós falamos um pouco sobre filantropia aqui e o seu estado e a sua cidade natal passaram por uma tragédia humanitária horrível em meados do século passado e você fez um trabalho de filantropia para tentar ajudar a melhorar a vida daquelas pessoas. Você não disse que você concorda com o Steve Jobs de que o que ele fez pela educação com os produtos dele, provavelmente será muito melhor do que toda a filantropia do Bill Gates junto. Mas eu lhe pergunto, será que o próprio Steve Jobs, ou você, ou qualquer pessoa, chega numa situação de tragédia humanitária e pode se dar o luxo de fazer uma declaração como essa? Eu vou continuar trabalhando aqui nos meus produtos, que isso vai fazer mais bem para as pessoas do que eu sair daqui e ajudar quem está passando por problemas sérios.
Look, everybody has to decide the values they live their life. He lived his life by the values of, I'm going to create amazing products in a company that'll continue to create amazing products. He had family members, his wife, who were great philanthropists, who spent a lot of time, giving money and being involved with education reform. As for me, I went back to New Orleans, my hometown, after the storm hit Louisiana, and we helped rebuild the school system. We helped do things because, that's the way Ben Franklin was. But we're all different. I've been involved in Teach for America, which is a way of getting the best kids to come teach in underserved cities. Different things give our lives different meaning. If you want to read a book about somebody very civic engaged and philanthropic, I got Ben Franklin. You can read him. Every week he created some new civic or philanthropic organization. Steve Jobs, he created great new products. I think in life we all grapple for what is the good life, as Aristotle would say. What gives our life meaning? And when you write biographies, you don't always give the answer. You just show, here's what Ben Franklin did. Here's what Einstein did. Here's what Steve Jobs did.
Walter, mais cedo você mencionou Foxconn, que é a empresa na China que fabrica iPhones, iPads, etc. Ultimamente tem saído algumas reportagens no New York Times e em outros jornais bastante reveladoras sobre as condições de trabalho nessas fábricas. Essa situação, assim, de repente, e justamente coincide com a publicação do livro, depois da morte do Steve Jobs. E há um foco maior nessas condições de trabalho, onde todos esses produtos que tantos nós gostamos são fabricados. Isso chega a ser uma ameaça para o legado de Steve Jobs?
I think that Apple is now trying to address it, so I assume that Tim Cook and the others at Apple feel that there should be a change. I don't think they'll come out and criticize the way it was handled under Steve, but I think there's a different set of values under Tim Cook, and he's addressed more forthrightly the problems at Foxconn. I admire Tim Cook for doing that. Will it be part of Steve's legacy that he did not do that? Yes.
O Steve Jobs sabia dessas condições de trabalho que existiam na Foxconn na China, que era uma espécie de trabalho escravo, muito mal pago. Ele sabia que era assim?
I think, as I said, that Steve's ability to focus also included an ability to just filter out and things that he didn't feel were important, that were distractions, he would ignore. Maybe the problem with the cancer for a while, which is, I'm not going to deal with this now. I've got things I'm going to focus on. As I said, I admire Apple now and Tim Cook for focusing on that. But Steve Jobs didn't. That's just the way he was.
Walter, vamos falar um pouquinho sobre o futuro dos jornalistas. Você é um dos grandes jornalistas contemporâneos nos Estados Unidos, onde nós tivemos tantos outros realmente que a gente conhece. E você está assistindo hoje coisas como a morte de jornalistas que tentam, em busca da notícia, entrar na Síria e serem tratados como foram tratados. Outros países que criam todas as barreiras contra a imprensa, porque a imprensa tem um papel realmente extraordinário em mostrar a realidade. Tá? Você acha que esses profissionais com esse valor, com esse talento, essa coragem, este amor pela notícia e pela verdade, eles estão no fim? Nós teremos, num futuro, para os nossos netos, vamos viver num mundo onde a imprensa terá profissionais deste valor e terá este tipo de contribuição?
You know, we've lived in a world for the past 10 years of blogs and the internet where it's difficult to make the business model work for traditional newspapers. But what have we seen in the past month? Really brave journalists risking their lives, 4 or 5 of them getting killed in Homs, Syria, or other parts of Syria. And they're the ones who are bringing us those pictures. They're the ones who are letting us know what's happening in Syria. So I think this past month has been another reminder about how important that type of journalism is. And if any kid was sitting out there saying, I don't need, mainstream journalists, I can just look at Twitter and find out what's happening, that was a pretty tough reminder when you see what's happening in Homs and then you think about people who risked their lives or lost their lives to cover it. So will we still have that? I'm so glad we have it now, people still wanting to go in the profession after 10 years of the blogosphere being the cool new thing to do. There's still people who want to do that. Why? Just like Steve Jobs or anybody else. They have a certain passion. They care about something. Different from what Steve cared about. But that passion to be a truth-seeking journalist, I think that's ingrained in our souls, reporting the truth. And people will be doing that even though it's dangerous, and it was dangerous back in the days of Vietnam, and it was dangerous probably in the days of the Peloponnesian War, for all I know. But people do it because they like telling the story of our times and giving people the truth. And I'm encouraged that there's still great journalists out there doing it.
O que você preferia, Walter? Ser diretor de redação, o que foi mais agradável? Ser diretor de redação da Time, estar lá no meio de 500 jornalistas, vendo toda a miséria do mundo passar pela tua frente, ou estar escrevendo um livro sozinho em casa, solitário, sem saber como é que vai acabar? O que é melhor?
You learn in life what you like to do and what's best. When I went to CNN, I was a manager, an executive, running a very large network. And I realized I didn't like it that much. I don't like being a boss. I don't like being a manager of Larry King and all these people. I do like being able to make things on my own, to write books, to write stories and whatever. And so after having been a manager at CNN, I moved away from it. Likewise, I found that I like print. I think print's a pretty good technology. And I love Time magazine. When I was a manager at Time, it was easier. There were just maybe 50 people I worked with, every week. And so I like working in a small team. I don't like being a manager of a big corporation. I like writing books. I like telling stories. It takes a while in life to figure out what do you like and what do you don't like. But for me, writing books, telling stories, doing journalism, to me is more important than being a boss or running a company.
Você ainda lê jornal em papel ou você lê tudo no computador?
I don't make much of a distinction. I read the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal every day, but I woke up today in Sao Paulo and I read it on my iPad. When I go home, I read the Washington Post on paper. As I told you earlier, I think paper is a very convenient technology. In my briefcase for when I go on the airplane, I have 3 or 4 magazines, more convenient than doing it on a computer. I think that books, newspapers, magazines, they'll form a balance. Probably a little bit more than half of what we consume will be electronic 10, 15 years from now. But close to half will be books on paper, magazines on paper, because I think it'll get into that balance. My book on Steve Jobs is selling about 50-50, e-books, physical. I think eventually it'll be 60-40. More than half the people will buy e-books and less than half will buy physical. But there'll still be 40%, maybe 35% of people who buy the paper newspaper, the paper magazine, the paper copy of the book. Not because they're old-fashioned, but just because it's a convenient technology.
Walter, dos seus livros vendidos nos Estados Unidos, quanto por cento vendeu na forma do e-book?
I think it's close to 45-50% was e-book and 50-55% was, but I'm not totally sure. And that's true of most nonfiction books now. It's close to half and half.
Que conselho você daria para um jornalista, um jovem jornalista brasileiro, não americano, que está começando hoje? Que conselho você daria?
Go someplace interesting. I mean, what happens is journalists these days sometimes think they can make a name by blogging, being an opinion writer. It's like, no, learn a language, go someplace very interesting, or even, you don't have to go to Syria. There are places in Brazil that are very interesting. But get out there and report. Same advice I gave Jay Carney, who is now the president's press secretary. When he graduated from college, shows how old I am, he came to me for a job. And I said, go someplace, work for a newspaper, cover police headquarters. And he did. He went to Miami, covered police headquarters. When he came back, I said, sure, have a job at Time Magazine. So I think you start with the reporting. People too often start with the opinion these days.
Você acha útil o jornalista fazer uma faculdade que não seja de jornalismo ou não? Porque tem essa discussão no Brasil. Se deve se cursar a faculdade de jornalismo, se deve se cursar outra faculdade para ser jornalismo, para ser jornalista.
I think it's useful to learn certain topics well. Not necessarily go to a journalism school, but learn economics, learn history, an appreciation for literature, learn about world affairs. So I think and learn about science. I think far too few journalists understand physics or technology. They don't know what does a transistor really do and how many transistors are there on a microchip. And those are the type of things you should know as a journalist and you should learn in college.
Walter, você como jornalista hoje, olhando o mundo em que nós estamos, como é que você vê esses 4 grandes países emergentes, Brasil, Rússia, Índia e China, dos BRICS? E, de outro lado, qual é a sua visão da crise europeia hoje?
I think that you can take the BRIC countries and say which ones of them are comfortable with the free flow of information, free speech, free ideas, democracy, and which ones aren't. And so you have Brazil and India that have a vibrant press, that have a vibrant political system, that are comfortable with the free flow of information. I don't think that's true in Russia and China as much. And I think what will be successful in the 21st century is our societies and our countries in which people are comfortable with the flow of information. Because it will be an information age. It'll be hard to stop the flow of information. As for the European crisis, I'll leave that to experts better than myself. But I do think that, it shows a test for democracy, whether it's in Greece or Italy or Portugal or Spain or, for that matter, the rest of Europe. Sometimes democracies are tempted to give out too many benefits.
Mas aquele sonho da unificação europeia, moeda única e de toda a integração europeia, esse sonho vai morrer com uma crise mais séria agora?
I think the euro will probably hold together. I'm not sure it was the best idea in the first place because I think it's hard to have a single currency when you don't have a single governance and a single budget and a single fiscal policy. But as I say, there'll be other people sitting in the seat who can answer that question better for you.
Bom, o programa Roda Viva, lamentavelmente, fica por aqui. Eu agradeço muito a presença do Walter Isaacson, da Paula Leite, do Etevaldo Siqueira, do Caio Túlio Costa, do Todd Benson e do Carlos Eduardo Lins e Silva, e, lógico, do nosso cartunista, o Paulo Caruso. Obrigado aos nossos telespectadores e até a próxima semana.